This is exactly what we planned, Larry. I showed you the plat map myself when we had coffee. Just tow the truck already.
The tow truck was already backed halfway into my driveway when I stepped outside barefoot, holding my coffee in one hand and my phone in the other. Its yellow lights flashed against my garage door like a warning sign, and the driver was crouched beside the front tire of my pickup, hooking chains to a truck that was parked exactly where I had parked it for 4 years. Across the driveway, my neighbor, Linda Mercer, stood with her arms folded and a smile that made my stomach tighten. Beside her was Greg Halston, the HOA president, holding a white folder stuffed with violation notices. His face was red, his jaw clenched, and every few seconds he jabbed one finger toward my truck like he was giving orders at a crime scene. Linda looked furious, but not surprised. That was the first thing I noticed. She was not reacting to some sudden mistake. She was waiting for this. She had her phone raised, recording me, while Greg told the tow driver that the vehicle was illegally blocking a community access lane. He said the HOA had already reviewed the matter and authorized removal. The problem was simple. That driveway was not a community lane. It was mine to use under a recorded easement attached to my deed. I had the closing papers, the survey, and the county record proving it. But Greg acted like none of that mattered. He waved the folder in my direction and said the HOA board had reclassified the driveway after receiving a formal complaint from Linda. That was when Linda lost control. Her face twisted, her voice rose, and she shouted that I had been abusing that driveway for long enough. She pointed at the side yard she had always wanted to expand and said the HOA had finally fixed the problem I refused to fix myself. Then she said the sentence that changed everything. She said she had already taken care of it with Greg. The tow driver paused. Greg stopped talking. Even Linda seemed to realize she had said too much. I did not yell back. I did not touch the chains. I just turned my phone camera toward all three of them and asked them to repeat who authorized the tow, what legal document gave them control of my driveway, and why a private easement recorded with the county was suddenly being treated like HOA property. 3 weeks later, that same driveway was lined with county survey flags. A sheriff's deputy was reading my easement out loud in front of half the neighborhood. Linda was staring at an $18,000 settlement demand, and Greg Halston was no longer president of the HOA. I never bought that house because it was impressive. It was not the biggest home in the neighborhood, not the newest, and definitely not the kind of place people slowed down to admire from the street. It was a small single-story house at the edge of a quiet suburban HOA community, with faded brick, an old maple tree in the front yard, and a detached garage tucked behind the house like it had been placed there before anyone thought about curb appeal. But to me, it was perfect. I bought it after years of renting apartments where I could hear every argument through the walls and every footstep from the unit above me. I wanted quiet. I wanted a garage where I could keep my tools. I wanted a place where I could come home after a long shift, pull into my own driveway, shut the door behind me, and not have to ask anyone for permission to exist. That driveway was one of the biggest reasons I bought the property. It ran along the left side of the house, narrow but long, leading from the street all the way back to the garage. It was not decorative, it was not extra space, it was functional, and for my life, it mattered more than a bigger kitchen or a finished basement. I worked as a medical equipment technician, which meant my schedule was never normal. Some mornings I left before sunrise. Some nights I came home after midnight with a truck full of diagnostic tools, replacement parts, oxygen concentrator components, and heavy cases I could not just carry from the street. When a hospital, clinic, or home care patient had equipment down, I had to move fast. That driveway let me load and unload safely without blocking the public road or dragging equipment across wet grass in the dark. Before I closed on the house, I read every document more carefully than most people probably would. The title report, the deed, the survey, the plat map, even the ugly legal description that looked like it had been written by someone allergic to plain English. Buried in all of it was one important thing: a recorded easement attached to my lot. The driveway sat near the property line, and a small section followed an old access strip between my house and Linda Mercer's property. But the right to use it for vehicle access belonged to my home. My closing attorney explained it clearly. As long as I owned that house, I had the legal right to use that driveway to reach my garage. It was not a favor from the HOA. It was not a handshake deal with a neighbor. It was part of the property rights recorded with the county. For the first year, nobody cared. I kept to myself. I mowed my lawn, paid my dues, waved at people walking dogs, and avoided HOA politics like it was a contagious disease. I was not interested in being on the board. I was not interested in neighborhood drama. I just wanted a peaceful place to live. Then Linda started making comments. At first, they were small enough to ignore. She would stand near her fence and stare when I backed my truck in. She would mention that the space between our houses looked awkward. She would talk about how nice her side yard could look if that old access lane was cleaned up and redesigned. She never said directly that she wanted my driveway, but every conversation circled the same point. She thought the space was wasted on me. Linda was popular in the neighborhood. She hosted holiday gatherings, ran the community yard sale, brought cookies to HOA meetings, and knew exactly how to make herself sound reasonable in front of other people. But when no one else was listening, her tone changed. She treated my driveway like a mistake she intended to correct. I still tried to be polite. I told myself it was just neighbor frustration. Every HOA neighborhood has someone who cares too much about fences, lawns, and where people park. I did not want to turn a few comments into a war. But looking back, I should have paid closer attention to the way she watched that driveway. Because when a neighbor starts calling your property community space, they are not just complaining. They are testing how hard you will fight when they try to take it. And if you have ever dealt with an HOA, or a neighbor who thinks your private property is theirs to manage, share your thoughts in the comments, because sometimes one line in a deed is the only thing standing between your home and somebody else's entitlement. At the time, I thought my paperwork was enough to keep the peace. I had no idea Linda was already walking into HOA meetings with photos of my truck, a fake story about blocked access, and a plan to make my own driveway look like a violation. The first official violation letter arrived on a Thursday afternoon, folded neatly inside an HOA envelope and taped to my front door like a public warning. I still remember standing on the porch with my work shirt half untucked, reading the first line twice because I honestly thought there had been some kind of mistake. According to the HOA, I was being fined $250 for improper vehicle storage on a shared community access lane. The letter claimed my pickup truck had been blocking access to a common area and interfering with another resident's reasonable use of HOA property. It gave me 48 hours to remove the vehicle, or the fine would increase daily. I stood there looking from the letter to my driveway, then back to the letter again. My truck was parked beside my own house, in front of my own garage, on the same driveway that had been listed in my closing documents and recorded with the county. There was no gate, no public path, no sidewalk, no shared parking sign, nothing that would make a reasonable person think it belonged to the HOA. I called the management office immediately. The woman who answered sounded like she had already been warned about me. She told me the board had reviewed multiple complaints and determined that the driveway was part of a shared access route between lots. I asked her to email me the document proving that. She paused, shuffled some papers, and said I would need to submit a formal records request. That was when I knew this was not just confusion. The next morning, Linda Mercer made her first real move. I opened my garage door and found her green golf cart parked across the front edge of my driveway, angled just enough that I could not back out without driving onto the grass. 2 large concrete planters sat beside it, filled with fake flowers, as if she had tried to make the obstruction look decorative. When I walked over and asked her to move it, she came out of her side door already smiling. She said the HOA had confirmed she was allowed to use her half of the access lane. I told her there was no her half. I told her the driveway was covered by my recorded easement. She rolled her eyes like I was boring her with technicalities and said I needed to stop hiding behind old paperwork. Then she said, very calmly, that the neighborhood was changing and I needed to change with it. By the end of that week, a second notice arrived. This one was harsher. It accused me of refusing to comply with an HOA directive, creating a nuisance, and interfering with community access. The fine had jumped to $750. It also warned that continued non-compliance could result in towing at the owner's expense. I emailed back copies of my deed page, the easement description, and the survey from my closing packet. I kept the message short and respectful. I said I believed the HOA was mistaken and asked them to identify the recorded document that gave the association authority over my driveway. No one answered the question. Instead, Greg Halston showed up at my door that Saturday in a pressed polo shirt with the HOA logo on the chest and a folder tucked under one arm. Linda stood on her porch pretending to water a plant that had clearly been dead for months. Greg did not greet me. He just told me the board had already made its determination. I asked him if he had read the recorded easement. He said HOA rules took priority inside the community. That was the first time I almost laughed, not because it was funny, but because the confidence in his voice was unbelievable. He was standing on my porch, telling me that a neighborhood rule book could erase a county-recorded property right because 3 people at a board meeting had decided it was inconvenient. When I told him that was not how property law worked, his face tightened. He stepped closer and lowered his voice. He said I was making this harder than it needed to be. He said most people in the community understood that cooperation mattered more than technical ownership. Then he tapped the folder against his palm and told me that if I forced the HOA to escalate, I would not like the outcome. Linda must have taken that as permission, because after that, she stopped pretending. She began placing her trash bins at the mouth of my driveway on pickup days, even when her own curb was empty. She started inviting guests to park with their bumpers hanging into my access lane. One evening, I came home from an emergency repair job and found orange reflective stakes hammered into the gravel strip along the side of the driveway. They had little ribbons tied to the top, like someone was marking off a construction site. When I pulled one out, Linda came running from her porch, shouting that I was destroying HOA-approved improvements. Her face was red, her hands were shaking, and she pointed at me like she had caught me stealing from her. She screamed loud enough for 3 neighbors to come outside. I tried to explain that she had no right to put anything there. She cut me off and shouted that everyone was tired of me acting like I owned the whole side yard. Then she said I should have sold the house to someone who knew how to live in a community. That sentence stuck with me, because it was not about access. It was not about safety. It was not about HOA rules. Linda wanted control over the strip between our houses, and Greg was helping her dress that up as enforcement. The final notice came 2 days later. It was labeled "Final Warning Before Vehicle Removal." It claimed my truck had been repeatedly parked on HOA-controlled property and said any vehicle found in violation after 8 a.m. Saturday could be removed without further notice. I sent one more email asking for the legal basis. Again, no answer. Saturday morning, I woke up to the sound of diesel brakes outside my bedroom window. When I looked through the blinds, the tow truck was already backing into my driveway. Linda was standing near the curb with her phone raised, smiling like she had waited all week for that exact moment. Greg was beside her, holding the authorization letter. For a few seconds, I just stood there and watched the scene unfold. The flashing yellow lights, the chains being pulled from the back of the truck, the folder in Greg's hand. Linda's expression, smug and certain, as if the driveway had already become hers. That was the moment I understood the truth. They were not warning me anymore. They were trying to create a paper trail where I looked like the violator, so they could bully me off my own property, one fine, one notice, and one tow truck at a time. So I opened my phone, started recording, and walked outside. The first thing I learned that morning was how powerful a phone camera can become when everyone else thinks intimidation is enough. I did not argue with the tow driver. I did not step in front of the truck, touch the chains, or give Greg any excuse to make me look unstable. I simply recorded. I recorded the tow truck sitting inside my driveway. I recorded Linda standing at the curb with her phone raised. I recorded Greg holding the authorization letter and insisting that the HOA had control over the access lane. Then I asked one calm question after another. Who requested the tow? Who signed the authorization? What document showed the HOA owned or controlled this driveway? What county record changed the easement attached to my deed? Nobody answered clearly. The tow driver suddenly looked less confident. He asked Greg if there was a property management contact he could call. Greg kept repeating that the HOA board had approved it. Linda kept saying I was trying to confuse everyone with paperwork, but the driver looked at my garage, then at the driveway, then at my truck, and I could see the doubt beginning to settle on his face. After 10 tense minutes, he unhooked the chain and said he was not towing anything until the ownership issue was verified. Linda exploded. Her voice cracked from anger. Her hands flew into the air, and she stormed toward the driver like he had betrayed her personally. Greg tried to calm her down, but I caught the whole thing on video. That was the moment I stopped treating this like a neighborhood misunderstanding. I went back inside, locked the door, made a folder on my laptop, and named it Driveway Easement Evidence. Then I started building a timeline. I scanned the first violation letter, the second notice, the final towing warning, and every envelope they came in. I saved the dates, the timestamps, the amounts, and the language they used. I downloaded every email I had sent to the HOA asking for the legal basis of their decision. I saved the management office's vague replies. I took screenshots of the online HOA portal showing the fines added to my account. Then I pulled out the closing binder I had not opened since the day I bought the house. Inside were the deed, the title policy, the old survey, and the legal description of the easement. I read them slower this time. I highlighted every line that referred to access, ingress, egress, and the driveway serving Lot 17. The wording was dry, almost painful to read, but it was clear enough. The easement was recorded. It ran with the property. It was not temporary, not optional, and not something an HOA president could erase with a violation notice. That night, I checked my security cameras. What I found made my hands go cold. The side camera had caught Linda walking onto the driveway multiple times over the past month. She had taken photos of my truck from different angles, placed her concrete planters near the entrance, moved them slightly, taken more photos, and then carried them back to her porch. She was not documenting a violation, she was creating one. Another clip showed her speaking with Greg near the property line after sunset. The audio was not perfect, but it was enough. Linda pointed toward my garage while Greg nodded and looked down at a folder. A few minutes later, Linda walked into the driveway and measured the distance from my truck to the edge of the grass with a tape measure, as if she were preparing evidence for a case she had already decided she would win. I saved every clip twice, once on my computer and once on an external drive. The next morning, I filed a formal written request for HOA records. I asked for the meeting minutes where my driveway had supposedly been reclassified, the complaint submitted against me, the board vote authorizing fines, and any legal opinion the HOA relied on before threatening to tow my vehicle. I sent the request by email and certified mail because by then, I understood something important. When people are willing to lie casually, delivery receipts matter. The HOA took 5 days to respond. When they finally sent the records, they were incomplete. The meeting minutes were vague, almost suspiciously vague. They said Linda had raised a concern about shared access and that the board had discussed enforcement options. There was no legal opinion, no county document, no recorded amendment, no vote by the homeowners. Nothing proving the driveway had ever become common property. But there was one line that caught my attention. Greg had stated that the HOA could reinterpret community access rules to resolve a neighbor dispute. That single sentence told me exactly what had happened. They had not discovered a rule. They had invented a position. So I went to the county recorder's office. I expected the process to be complicated, but the clerk behind the counter found the documents in less than 10 minutes. She pulled the recorded plat, the deed history, and the easement language tied to my lot. Then she looked up the HOA's recorded common area boundaries. My driveway was not included. No amendment had been filed. No easement release existed. No transfer of rights had ever been recorded. In plain English, the county records still showed what my closing papers had shown from the beginning. The driveway access belonged to my property. I paid for certified copies of everything. After that, I hired an independent surveyor. He arrived 2 days later with a tripod, marking flags, and the quiet confidence of someone who had seen too many neighbors fight over inches of land. Linda watched from her porch the entire time. She did not speak to me, but she took photos of the surveyor like she was building her own file. By the end of the survey, the flags told a story Greg and Linda could not talk their way around. The planters, the reflective stakes, and the edge of Linda's golf cart parking spot all sat inside the access area tied to my easement. The surveyor gave me a written report, stamped and signed. That report changed the way my attorney sounded on the phone. At first he had been cautious, the way attorneys are when they have only heard one side. But after I sent the deed, the certified county records, the HOA notices, the camera clips, the meeting minutes, and the survey report, his tone became sharper. He told me the HOA was not just making a mistake, they were interfering with a recorded property right after being asked repeatedly to produce their authority. 2 days later, he sent a demand letter. It required the HOA to remove all fines, stop threatening to tow vehicles from my driveway, preserve all communications related to Linda's complaint, and provide any financial records connected to the so-called access dispute. It also demanded that Linda stop placing objects, vehicles, planters, or markers inside the easement area. For the first time since the whole thing began, the neighborhood went quiet. Linda stopped standing outside when I came home. Greg stopped sending notices. The HOA portal still showed the fines, but no new ones appeared. It felt like the air before a storm, when everyone knows something is coming, but nobody wants to be the first to admit it. Then my attorney called again. He had found something in the HOA records request that I had almost missed. A payment, a private contribution from Linda to the HOA's landscaping fund, made just days before the board voted to fine me over the driveway. And that was when this stopped being a driveway dispute and started looking like something much worse. When my attorney mentioned Linda's payment to the HOA landscaping fund, I did not understand at first why it mattered so much. On paper, it looked harmless. $2,500, labeled as a voluntary improvement contribution. The kind of thing a neighborhood busybody might donate so the entrance sign could get new flowers, or the pool area could get fresh mulch. If that had been all it was, I probably would have ignored it. But the date changed everything. Linda made that payment 3 days before the HOA board voted to fine me for using my own driveway. My attorney asked me to send him every email, every notice, every record request response, and every screenshot from the HOA portal again. He wanted the timeline built down to the hour. By then, I had learned not to question why details mattered. In property disputes, one sentence can beat 100 excuses, and one date can expose an entire lie. 2 days later, he called me back. His voice was calm, but there was something different underneath it. He had found an email chain in the documents the HOA had reluctantly turned over. It was not in the main packet. It had been buried inside an attachment labeled Landscaping Follow-up, probably because someone thought no one would read that far. In the email, Linda thanked Greg for helping with the driveway problem and wrote that she was happy to contribute to the Community Improvement Fund now that the board understood how important access was to her property. Greg responded that the board would do what it could, within enforcement rules, and that the situation should be resolved once the fines created enough pressure. Enough pressure. I sat in my kitchen with the phone against my ear, staring out at the driveway while those two words settled in my chest. They were not trying to enforce a real rule. They were trying to pressure me until I gave up a recorded property right. The fines, the notices, the threats, even the tow truck, all of it had been part of a strategy to make my driveway too expensive and stressful to defend. Then my attorney found the second problem. The towing authorization letter Greg signed did not just say the HOA wanted my truck removed. It described my driveway as HOA-controlled common access property. That was not an opinion. That was a factual claim, and it was false. The county records showed no such thing. The HOA's own recorded common area map showed no such thing. The survey showed no such thing. Greg had signed a document giving a towing company permission to remove a vehicle from property the HOA did not control. That mistake was bigger than Greg realized. My attorney explained that an HOA can send all the angry letters it wants, but it cannot magically convert a private easement into common property. It cannot use fines to interfere with rights recorded in a deed. It cannot authorize a tow from a driveway it has no legal control over. And it definitely cannot do it after being repeatedly asked to produce the document that gives it authority. For the first time, I felt the whole case turn. Until then, I had felt like I was defending myself from people with more power, more connections, and more confidence. Linda had the social circle. Greg had the title. The HOA had the letterhead, the management company, the fine schedule, and the ability to make my account look delinquent. They had made me feel like the burden was on me to prove I had a right to use something I had legally owned access to from the day I bought the house. But the law did not see it that way. The easement was recorded before Linda ever moved in. It ran with my property. The HOA documents did not erase it. Linda's preferences did not weaken it. Greg's signature did not override it. The board's vote did not change the county record. The more my attorney explained it, the clearer it became that I had not been violating anything. They had been interfering with me. Then came the detail that made Linda's plans start falling apart from another direction. My title insurance policy covered disputes involving recorded easements. I had almost forgotten about that policy. Like most homeowners, I thought of title insurance as one of those closing costs you pay once and never think about again. But when my attorney reviewed the policy, he told me to file a claim. The easement was part of what had been insured when I bought the property. If someone was challenging or interfering with that right, the title insurance company had a reason to get involved. That changed the money problem overnight. Linda and Greg had probably assumed I would get tired, get scared, or run out of cash before anything serious happened. They thought every attorney letter would hurt me more than it hurt them. They thought a working person with a small house and a used pickup would eventually decide the fight was not worth it. But now the title company wanted copies of everything. They wanted the deed, they wanted the survey, they wanted the HOA notices, they wanted the towing authorization, they wanted the certified county records, they wanted the email where Linda tied her contribution to the driveway issue. And once they saw the full timeline, they sent their own letter to the HOA, warning that any continued interference with the easement could trigger further legal action. That was when the silence from Greg became noticeable. The man who had shown up at my door with a folder and a threat suddenly stopped answering emails directly. The management company began writing in careful phrases. The HOA portal quietly removed the daily fine increase, though the original balance still sat there like a stubborn stain. Linda stopped parking her golf cart across the driveway, but she did not remove the planters. Instead, she made one final mistake. She sent me a handwritten note and taped it to my garage door. In it, she claimed I was harassing her, preventing her from enjoying her property, and using legal technicalities to block a driveway that the neighborhood had always treated as shared. She wrote that if I did not agree to a compromise, she would make sure the HOA took stronger action. I photographed the note before I touched it. Then I placed it in a plastic sleeve and sent a copy to my attorney. He called it useful. The next demand letter was not polite in the way the first one had been. It accused the HOA of knowingly misrepresenting property rights, interfering with a recorded easement, allowing a board officer to use HOA enforcement for a private neighbor dispute, and failing to preserve clean records after receiving notice of a legal claim. It demanded the removal of every object Linda had placed in the easement area, a written retraction of the violation notices, reimbursement of my survey costs, and confirmation that the HOA would never again authorize towing from that driveway. It also named Linda personally. That part mattered. Up to that point, she had been hiding behind the HOA like it was a shield. Every time she blocked the driveway, it was because the board allowed it. Every time she complained, it was because the community had rights. Every time she pushed, Greg stood in front of her with official-looking paper. Now the paper was pointed back at her. My attorney gave them 7 days to respond. On the 6th day, Linda blocked the driveway again. On the 6th day, Linda blocked the driveway again. This time, it was not a golf cart or a planter. It was her SUV, parked sideways across the entrance like a barricade. The front bumper sat inches from my mailbox. The rear bumper hung over the edge of the easement, and there was no way for my truck to get out without tearing up the lawn or hitting her vehicle. I stood at the window for a few seconds, staring at it. Then I did exactly what my attorney had told me to do. I took photos from every angle. I recorded a slow video showing my garage, my truck, the driveway, the SUV, and the survey flags still marking the access area. I did not knock on Linda's door. I did not yell across the yard. I did not give her the confrontation she wanted. I called the sheriff's office. Linda came outside before the deputy even arrived. She had that same confident look on her face, but this time it looked forced. She told me I was wasting everyone's time. She said the HOA had already confirmed the driveway was shared and that I could not use law enforcement to bully a neighbor. A few people stepped onto their porches, drawn by the sight of her SUV blocking the lane and me standing there with a folder in my hand. Then Greg showed up. He came walking fast from 2 houses down, wearing his HOA polo and carrying the same kind of folder he always carried when he wanted paper to look like power. He told Linda not to move the SUV until the officer heard both sides. Then he looked at me and said I had escalated a civil matter for no reason. When the deputy pulled up, Linda immediately started talking. She told him I had been harassing her over a community driveway. Greg handed over a violation notice and said the HOA had authority over common access areas. They spoke quickly, confidently, almost over each other, trying to frame the situation before I could say a word. The deputy listened. Then he turned to me. I handed him certified copies of the deed, the recorded easement, the survey report, the county plat, the attorney's demand letter, and the photos of Linda's SUV sitting inside the marked access area. He stood by his patrol car and read quietly while the whole street seemed to hold its breath. The change in his expression was small, but I saw it. He looked at the survey, then at the driveway, then at Linda's SUV, then back at the easement language. After a long moment, he asked Greg if the HOA had any recorded document showing that this private easement had been released, transferred, or converted into common property. Greg started talking about board authority. The deputy stopped him and asked again for a recorded document. Greg did not have one. That was the moment the power shifted in front of everyone. The deputy explained, calmly but firmly, that an HOA rule did not override a recorded easement. He told Linda that blocking a lawful access easement could create legal consequences beyond an HOA disagreement. Then he told her to move the SUV. Linda's face went pale. She tried to argue, but the deputy repeated himself. Move the vehicle. While Linda climbed into her SUV, hands shaking against the steering wheel, the deputy read the key part of the easement out loud. I did not ask him to. He just did it while confirming the access right, and every neighbor standing outside heard the words that Greg and Linda had spent weeks pretending did not exist. The next hit came from code enforcement. My attorney had already sent them the survey and photos of the planters, reflective stakes, and low decorative barrier Linda had installed inside the easement area. An inspector arrived that afternoon. He measured the objects against the survey flags, checked the permit database from his tablet, and told Linda there was no approved permit for any structure or obstruction inside that access strip. She had 48 hours to remove everything. By the following week, the issue reached the HOA public meeting. My attorney attended with a binder thick enough to make Greg look physically uncomfortable. He laid out the timeline: Linda's complaint, her $2,500 contribution, the vague board minutes, the false towing authorization, the unanswered requests for legal authority, the county records, the survey, the sheriff's response, and the code enforcement notice. For once, Greg could not interrupt his way out of it. Homeowners started asking questions. Why had HOA funds been used to pursue a private driveway dispute? Why had fines been issued without verifying county records? Why had a tow been authorized from property the HOA did not control? And why had Linda's donation arrived right before the board took action against me? Linda stared at the table. Greg kept flipping through his folder like the answer might magically appear between the pages. But there was no answer. There was only a recorded easement, a false paper trail, a sheriff's warning, a code enforcement order, and a room full of neighbors realizing the HOA had not protected the community. It had protected Linda. By the end of that HOA meeting, Greg Halston looked like a man who had finally realized a folder full of violation notices could not protect him from county records. The board went into executive session that night, but the damage had already been done in front of the entire room. Homeowners who had ignored the issue for weeks were suddenly angry, not just because of what Linda had done to me, but because the HOA had used its authority to help one neighbor pressure another out of a recorded property right. 2 days later, I received a formal letter from the management company. Every fine on my account had been removed. The towing warning had been withdrawn. The HOA admitted, in writing, that it had no recorded ownership or control over my driveway easement. They did not apologize in warm, human language, but legal language was enough. It was the first time they had written the truth. Greg resigned the following week. The letter called it a personal decision. Everyone in the neighborhood knew it was not. After the emails, the donation, the false towing authorization, and the sheriff's visit, there was no way he could keep pretending he had acted for the good of the community. The board also voted to require county record verification before issuing any future violation involving property lines, easements, fences, driveways, or access rights. Linda lasted longer. She refused to speak to me, refused to look at my house, and for a while she tried to act like she was the real victim. But once my attorney added up the survey cost, driveway repair, legal fees, title insurance involvement, and the damage caused by her obstructions, the numbers stopped being emotional and became expensive. In the end, Linda signed a settlement agreement. She paid a little over $18,000, removed every planter, stake, and barrier from the easement area, and agreed in writing that she would never block, interfere with, modify, decorate, mark, or claim any part of that driveway again. The towing company also cut ties with the HOA. I heard later that they changed their policy and started requiring proof of control before removing vehicles from private residential property. I do not know if that was because of me, but I know they never came back to my driveway. A month later, I pulled into my garage after a late-night service call and sat there for a moment with the engine off. The side yard was quiet. No golf cart, no planters, no orange stakes, no tow truck lights flashing against my garage door. Just my driveway, clear from the street to the back of the house, exactly the way it had been when I bought the place. I did not win because I yelled louder than Linda. I did not win because I threatened Greg. I did not damage anyone's property, spread rumors, or try to get revenge in the dark. I won because I kept the letters, saved the footage, read the deed, checked the county records, hired the right professionals, and refused to let someone else rewrite my property rights with pressure and lies. That is the thing about boundaries. Sometimes they are fences. Sometimes they are survey flags. Sometimes they are one paragraph in a deed that nobody bothers to read until someone tries to take what is yours. And if this story sounds familiar, if you have ever had a neighbor, an HOA, or a board member act like your private property was theirs to control, leave your thoughts in the comments. Share this with someone who needs to hear it, save it for later, and subscribe for more stories where the loudest person in the neighborhood does not always win. Sometimes, the person with the paperwork does.